The morning Clara Whitlock's world cracked open, she was standing at her market table with flowers still dusted across her apron and a slice of apple pie balanced carefully on a cloth. She had saved it for him again, 2 Saturdays gone. No Silas, no explanation, just an empty space where a man used to stand and pretend he was only there for the pastry. Then old Gerald Pruitt leaned across the next stall and said it loud enough for half the market to hear, "You know he's probably just done with you, Clara. Men like that don't need a woman with notions about owning things. Probably found someone sensible." He laughed at his own words. Clara set the pie down very slowly, her jaw tightened. She didn't say a single thing back to Gerald Pruitt, but her hands were shaking. If you've ever saved something for someone who didn't come, you already know exactly how this story ends. And if you think you do, stay with me, because you don't. Subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way through, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit that like button and drop your city or country. In the comments, I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The table had been in the Whitlock family longer than Clara had. Her mother had hauled it to market every Saturday for 31 years, first in the back of her father's wagon, then in a borrowed cart after he passed, then finally on the back of a mule that Clara herself learned to handle at 14. The wood was warped along one edge from years of weather. One of the legs had been repaired so many times it was more iron bracket than oak by now. Clara could have replaced it a dozen times over. She never did. Some things you keep not because they're beautiful, but because they're yours. The Red Willow Crossing Saturday Market ran along the main road from April through October, weather allowing, and Clara had occupied the third stall from the south end for going on 6 years. 6 years of early mornings and leftover flour in her hair, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by noise all day and returning home to silence. She wasn't bitter about it. She had chosen it, more or less. But she also wasn't pretending it was something it wasn't. She made bread the way other women made conversation constantly, reflexively, as a way of being present in the world when other options felt closed off. Sorto on Tuesdays, a soft milk loaf on Thursdays. Pies when the season offered fruit cheap enough to justify the time. Apple was her best. Everyone in Red Willow Crossing knew it, even the people who couldn't afford to buy it regularly and came by just to smell the table when they walked past. She had learned to bake from her mother, who had learned from her mother before that, and somewhere in that chain of inheritance was the understanding that women in their family fed people. That was the job. That was the contribution. Her mother had put food on tables and kept her family afloat and spent 40 years building something that technically belonged to her husband, then to her sons after that, while her name appeared on exactly nothing. Clara had watched that every single year of her childhood, and she had made herself a promise that felt almost violent in its certainty. Her name would be on something. One thing at least. One door. One deed. One piece of paper with her signature at the bottom that no one could argue over. The problem was that promises made in the heat of childhood don't always come with practical instructions. By 1888, Clara Whitlock was 34 years old, managing modest debt from a bad season 2 years prior, and operating out of a market stall that she did not own because the town of Red Willow Crossing offered no permanent vendor spaces to women operating alone. She had a small house at the edge of town, a decent mule, and more skill in that warped-leg table than most people had in their entire businesses. What she did not have was a building with her name on it. What she did not have was anything that looked, from the outside, like the life she had promised herself. She was working on that, slowly. The numbers were still about $60 short of what she needed to feel safe enough to even walk into the bank and ask. That was the state of things the first Saturday that Silas Harrow appeared. It was late April. Cold still lingered in the mornings the way it did in high country, polite enough to loosen by afternoon, but unwilling to fully leave. Clara had a canvas cover over part of her table, and her breath was fogging slightly when the man stopped in front of her pies. He was maybe 40, which she guessed more from his posture than his face. The kind of posture that comes from years of physical work that the body starts to argue with. broad through the shoulders, a little deliberate in how he moved, like he was accounting for something that used to be easier. He had dark hair that had given up some ground to gray at the temples, and he looked at her table with the expression of a man who had walked in expecting to buy something practical and found himself unexpectedly uncertain. "Apple," he said. "That's the pie," Clara confirmed. "How much for a slice?" she told him. He paid without negotiating, which she noted because most people at least made a face. He took the slice wrapped in cloth, nodded once, and walked away. She forgot him before he reached the end of the stall row. The next Saturday he was back, same request, same wordless nod, same departure. By the third week, Clara had started watching for him without meaning to, and was mildly irritated at herself when she noticed she had. The fourth week, when he arrived, she had saved the best slice instead of first come, first served. She didn't tell herself why, she was very careful not to. By June, they were talking, not about anything that mattered at first. He asked whether she baked the bread too, and she said yes. She asked whether he came in from far, and he said Iron Mesa, 7 miles south along the Ridge Road. She said that was a long way for pie, and he said it was good pie. That should have been the whole conversation. For two people keeping careful emotional distance, it nearly was. But somewhere in the back half of summer, the conversation started lasting longer than the transaction required. He told her about the ranch, not bragging about it, just describing it the way you describe a place that costs you sleep, but that you can't imagine leaving. 400 acres, a horse operation, mostly some cattle. 2 hired men in the busy season, just himself the rest of the year. He'd built most of the fencing himself over the course of a decade. She told him about the bread, and then, carefully, about the feed store. She watched his face when she said at the building at the end of Territorial Road, the one with the broken front window and the swallows living in the eaves. She explained what she thought it could be. A proper bakery. Fixed hours. Fixed address. Fixed future. Her name on the deed. She said that last part quietly because she had learned that saying it too loud made certain people want to discuss why that was unnecessary, and she wasn't in the mood for that conversation on a Saturday morning. Silas Harrow listened. He didn't offer opinions she hadn't asked for. He didn't tell her it was a fine idea or a foolish one. He said, "How long have you been saving for it?" She told him. He nodded, like that answered something, and then he said he'd see her next Saturday. That was late August. She told herself it still wasn't anything. Just a customer. Just a polite man from a ranch south of town who happened to have good manners and the good sense to keep his ideas about her plans to himself. Then one Saturday in September, he arrived later than usual. She had already started packing the table. He walked up looking like a man who had argued with himself the whole 7 miles and hadn't quite won. "I almost didn't come," he said. "The pie would have kept," Clara said. It wasn't about the pie. She stopped packing. He didn't say anything else. Just looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, not quite apologetic, not quite hopeful. Somewhere between the two, like a man standing on uncertain ground and trying to figure out whether it would hold his weight. "Silas," she said slowly, "are you going to say something? Or are we going to stand here until one of us catches cold?" He almost smiled. "My wife died 4 years ago." Clara set down what she was holding. "Her name was Evelyn," he continued. She was a good woman. She deserved more time than she got." He paused. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I just thought you should know why. I'm not why I don't always know how to be in a conversation like this without feeling like I'm doing something wrong." It was more words at once than she'd heard from him in months. She thought about what to say. She thought about several things she could say, the kind of things you say when someone opens a door they've kept shut for a long time. She thought about being gentle and about being cautious and about the various ways a woman in her position had learned to manage other people's feelings while keeping her own somewhere they wouldn't get stepped on. What she said was, "I appreciate you telling me, and then, next Saturday, I'll save you the end piece. The crust comes out better on the end." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Clara." He walked away again. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, even if neither was prepared to say so out loud yet. October came. then November, which was when the market closed for the season. The last Saturday before it shut down, Clara sold out of pie by 10 in the morning. She had not anticipated that, and she stood behind her table feeling obscurely guilty, like she had failed to provide something she'd made an unspoken promise to deliver. When Silas arrived at his usual time and found nothing left, he stood there for a moment in a way that made Claire feel unreasonably terrible. "I can bring one by," she said before she'd fully thought it through. "I'll bake tomorrow. I can leave a pie I don't know if you come through town during the week." "I can come through town," he said. "Tuesday, then. Leave it at Pruitt's counter with your name on it." It was an entirely ordinary arrangement. It was also the first time either of them had made a plan that extended past Saturday, and they both stood with that fact for a second longer than was strictly comfortable. "Tuesday," Silas said. He left. Clara packed her table and told herself nothing had changed. That the market closing for winter simply meant a different arrangement. That she was a grown woman who had been running her own operation for 6 years and was fully capable of making a practical decision without attaching meaning to it. She went home and baked 3 pies before she admitted she was only leaving one at Pruitt's counter. The other 2 she kept. She sat in her kitchen and ate one of them in the dark, with a fork straight from the dish, which was not something she usually permitted herself. And she thought about a man who had ridden 7 miles every Saturday for 8 months, and finally told her his wife's name. She thought about what it cost him to say it. She thought about Evelyn. It was a strange thing to feel tenderness toward a woman she had never met. But she did, sitting there in the dark with apple on her tongue and flour still in the creases of her hands. She thought about someone who had been loved and then lost and then held on to, the way you hold on to something that's already gone because you're not ready to admit that your hands are empty. She thought about her mother's empty hands. She thought about the feed store on Territorial Road. She thought about $60 and a banker who would make her explain herself 3 times before he believed she meant it. Ate the rest of the pie. Come spring, the market opened again. Silas was there on the first Saturday, same time, same quiet nod. But the nod was different now. They both knew it. By April, they were talking for 40 minutes at a stretch before he'd remember he was supposed to be buying pie, and she'd remember she was supposed to be selling it to other people. She started making excuses about why the table didn't need much tending, which was obviously untrue. He started arriving earlier, which was obviously deliberate. Red Willow Crossing noticed, because small towns always notice, and they have opinions about what they notice, especially where women operating independently are concerned. Old Gerald Pruitt made one comment in Clara's presence that she dealt with in 2 flat sentences and a look that ended the topic permanently, at least when she was within earshot. She heard the rest of it second-hand, that she was setting her cap at a widower with a ranch, that it was practical at her age, that Silas Harrow was a sensible man who'd come around to needing a woman in the house again, and she'd be wise to make herself agreeable. She did not tell Silas any of this, but she thought about it in the same way she thought about the feed store with a particular kind of anger that didn't go away, but that she had learned to put somewhere useful. She was not setting her cap at anything. She wasn't entirely certain what she was doing, if she was being honest. Which she tried to be, mostly because dishonesty required more energy than she had on top of everything else. What she knew was that on the Saturdays Silas Harrow stood at her table, the market felt less like something she was enduring and more like somewhere she was choosing to be. And she knew she was not going to mistake that feeling for a plan, because feelings were not plans, and she had seen what happened to women who confused the two. So she kept baking, she kept saving, she kept making plans, and she kept, with a discipline she was quietly proud of, refusing to let those plans depend on anyone but herself. The second Saturday of June 1000, 889 arrived the same way every Saturday arrived too early, with flour on everything, and the particular blue light of a morning that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to be beautiful or brutal. Clara set out bread and preserves and 4 pies and 1 slice, set slightly apart, which she absolutely was not saving for anyone. She told herself that until 10 o'clock. At 10:15, she admitted she was. By 11, The market was crowded and Silas had still not appeared. By noon, people were starting to pack up their midday goods, and Clara's apple pie was getting a film across the top from the heat. Gerald Pruitt wandered over with his hands in his pockets. He looked at the pie. He looked at Clara. He smiled in the way men smile when they think they know something you don't want them to know. Saving that for someone, he said. I'm saving it to eat myself, Clara said evenly. He rocked on his heels. Harrow's not coming, you know. Saw his hired man in town yesterday. Said Silas had himself some kind of trouble out at the ranch. Clara's hands went still. What kind of trouble? Pruitt shrugged. Ranch trouble. Could be anything. He paused, with the particular cruelty of people who enjoy delivering information badly. Or nothing. Man probably just had business, probably just forgot. Another pause. Wouldn't read too much into a man who buys pie. He walked away. Clara wrapped the slice. She set it carefully under the table where it would stay cooler. She finished out the market. She smiled at the right people, made change correctly, didn't drop anything. Then she went home and stood in her kitchen for a full 10 minutes doing nothing, which was something she almost never permitted herself. Ranch trouble. Could be anything. She thought about a man who had told her his wife's name after 8 months of Saturdays. She thought about a house 7 miles south where a man lived alone with 2 hired hands who worked seasonal. She thought about what ranch trouble looked like when there was no one checking on you. She thought about the shawl he'd mentioned once, briefly that Evelyn had loved to watch the sunrise from the porch, that she used to bring her shawl out and sit until the coffee got cold. She thought about a house where someone might sit with a cold cup of coffee and not get up. She went to bed and told herself it was not her business. She lay awake and knew that wasn't true. The second Saturday came. No Silas. Clara packed the table. She tied her mule. She stood for a moment at the south end of the market road, looking toward the ridge road that led to Iron Mesa. Gerald Pruitt called across from his stall. Still waiting, Clara? She turned and looked at him for a long moment. Then she untied the mule, and she rode south. The ridge road south of Red Willow Crossing was not the kind of road that forgave inattention. Clara had ridden it once before in the other direction, when she'd first come to town 6 years ago with everything she owned loaded onto a borrowed wagon and a very specific plan for how her life was going to look. The plan had been revised considerably since then. The road had not improved at all. It was rutted from spring runoff and crowded on both sides by scrub brush that grabbed at her skirt when she rode too close to the edge. And the dry creek bed Silas had mentioned, the one you had to cross, about 2 miles south of the Market Road turnoff, was less a crossing and more a prayer, because the flat stones were slick from the shade, and her mule had opinions about slick stones. She got across. The mule registered its complaint and moved on. Clara had ridden out without fully thinking through what she was going to say when she arrived. This was not typical of her. She was by habit and by necessity a woman who thought things through. You didn't manage 6 years of solo operation on a market table without learning to plan 3 steps ahead. But she had untied the mule and started south before the thinking part caught up with the doing part, and now she was 2 miles out and committed, with nothing prepared except the vague intention of checking that a man she cared about, which was a word she still wasn't using out loud, was not dead in a ditch somewhere. She told herself it was a neighborly errand. She told herself anyone would do this. She was aware she was lying to herself and did it anyway, because sometimes you need to do the thing before you can afford to be honest about why. The lightning-split cottonwood appeared on her left, about 4 miles out, exactly where Silas had described it the one time he'd given her directions she'd told herself she was only half listening to. She turned right at the cottonwood onto a track that was barely a track at all, 2-wheel ruts pressed into dry grass, leading up a gentle rise toward a cluster of buildings she could see from a 1/4 mile away. Iron Mesa Ranch was not what she'd imagined, and she'd spent a fair amount of time making sure she wasn't imagining it. It was large for a solo operation, the main house solid and square in a way that meant serious money had gone into the foundation, though the outbuildings showed the patchy repairs of a man working alone. A barn, a tack shed, 2 corrals. The horses in the near corral were well kept, which told her the operation was genuine and not just a story. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that had gone somewhat to weed, the kind of garden that someone had started with intention and then let slide when other things crowded in. She was still taking inventory when she saw him. He was on the ground beside the far corral fence, and for one terrible second her heart stopped completely, because he was down and not moving, and the second between seeing him and understanding what she was seeing felt like it lasted a year. Then he moved. His head came up, and she could see he was conscious, but the way he was positioned half sitting against the bottom rail, one leg extended at an angle that was all wrong, told her everything else she needed to know. She kicked the mule into a faster walk, which was the fastest she trusted on the uneven ground, and was down from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped. Silas. He looked up at her. His face was gray under the tan, and his eyes had that particular brightness that wasn't alertness. It was fever, and she'd seen enough of both to know the difference. He'd been out here for a while. The way his lips were cracked and the layer of sweat dried on his collar told her it was more than a few hours. Clara, his voice came out rough and confused, like he wasn't entirely certain she was real. "What are you? How did you? Don't try to explain yourself right now," she said. She crouched beside him and put her hand on his forehead, and it was like touching a stove. "How long have you been down?" He started to say something dismissive. She could see it forming on his face, the particular expression men get when they're about to tell a woman it's not as bad as it looks. She gave him a look that she usually reserved for Gerald Pruitt, and he stopped. "Since yesterday morning," he said. "Yesterday." She said it flat, not a question. "I didn't want to. My men are in town for the weekend. I didn't want to." "We're not having that conversation right now," Clara said. "Where's the nearest farm?" "Kemper Place, half-mile east." "Do they have a boy who can ride?" Silas looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read through the fever haze. "Oldest boy's maybe 12, that's enough." She stood up. "I'm going to get him to ride for Dr. Vale. While I'm gone, don't move." "I mean it, Silas. You move around on that leg and you'll make it worse. You can't go off the property alone and—" "I do everything alone," Clara said, and it came out sharper than she intended. "I'll be back in 15 minutes. Stay down." She was back in 12. The Kemper boy had already been on his horse and halfway to the road by the time she finished her sentence, moving with the wonderful urgency that 12-year-olds apply to anything that resembles an emergency. Dr. Amos Vale was in town on Saturdays. She'd told the boy to ride straight to the surgery and not stop. When she got back to the corral, Silas had managed to work himself upright against the fence, which was not staying down, but was at least better than horizontal. "I told you not to move. I didn't want you to come back and find me lying in the dirt." "I'd have preferred the dirt to you putting weight on that leg," Clara said, and came to stand beside him. She looked at the leg properly for the first time and kept her face neutral with some effort. The injury was above the knee. Something had hit it, the fence rail by the look of the bruising pattern, and the wound beneath the torn fabric of his trousers was red in a way that had nothing to do with the original impact and everything to do with 3 days without proper cleaning. She helped him back into the house without discussing it much, because there wasn't much to discuss. He was a large man, and it was harder than she made it look, but she'd loaded 100-pound flour sacks since she was 15, and she wasn't about to let the mathematics of the situation defeat her. He tried twice to do more of the work himself, and she told him both times to lean on her instead of arguing about it. And the second time, something in her voice made him stop arguing. Inside, the house hit her like a held breath finally released. It was clean, that was the first thing. Not bachelor messy the way she'd halfway expected. The floors were swept, the table cleared, the dishes stacked. But there was a particular quality to the cleanliness that told her it was the kind of order that comes from maintenance rather than life. The difference between a house that's kept and a house that's lived in. A chair by the window sat at an angle that suggested it hadn't been moved in a long time. On the peg beside the door hung a woman's shawl, dark blue wool, and Clara's eyes went to it for just a moment before she looked away. She got Silas onto the settee. She found the kitchen, found water, found clean cloth that she tore into strips without asking permission, because the time for asking permission was before the infection set in. She came back with what she needed and started cleaning the wound, and Silas said nothing. Just gripped the arm of the settee and stared at the ceiling with the focused expression of a man counting the seconds between himself and something he'd rather not feel. "This is going to hurt more before I'm done," she told him honestly. I figured. "Do you want something to bite on, Clara?" "It's a fair question." "No," he said. "I don't want something to bite on." Just stopped. "Just keep talking. Say something." "About what?" "Anything." "Something about the bakery." She looked up at him. His jaw was set and his hands were white-knuckled on the settee arm, and he was looking at the ceiling with
The kind of fierce concentration you apply to not making a sound in front of someone you'd rather not make a sound in front of.
"The floors are going to need replacing," she said, and started cleaning. The whole front half. Someone's let water sit along the south wall and the boards have gone soft. That's probably 2 weeks of work before you can even think about putting anything else in. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands steady. "I looked at the ceiling last time I walked past. The height is good, better than I expected. You could put in a proper shelf system on the east wall without losing light from the west window." Silas exhaled through his teeth. "Keep going," he said. "The window itself is broken. The swallows have a nest in the eaves above it. I can't decide whether I'm going to feel worse about the window or the swallows when I have to deal with both." Something that was almost a laugh escaped him. She kept talking. About the bakery, about the specific measurement she'd paced out when she'd stood across the street, calculating square footage like a woman doing something illegal. About the flour supplier in Casper, who offered better pricing than anything available in town if you could manage the logistics of a monthly order. She talked and she worked, and by the time Dr. Vale's buggy came rattling up the track an hour later, she had done everything she could do, and Silas had not made a sound. And she wasn't going to think too carefully about what it meant that she'd managed to talk for a full hour about an empty building she didn't own yet, and he'd listened to every word. Dr. Vale was a compact man in his 60s who had been practicing on the frontier long enough that nothing surprised him, including finding a woman alone at a bachelor rancher's house who had clearly just handled a medical situation competently and without fainting. He checked Silas's leg, checked the wound, nodded twice at Clara's work, and once at her in a way she decided to take as a compliment, and told them both what she'd already suspected. The infection was serious. The fever was higher than it looked. Silas needed to stay completely off the leg for at least a week and have the wound cleaned and redressed twice daily. And someone needed to be here to watch for the fever spiking, because if it went much higher, there was a point past which the distance to town became a serious problem. He looked at Clara when he finished saying this. She looked back at him. "I'll stay," she said, which was a sentence with a large number of implications she chose not to examine in front of the doctor. Dr. Vale said he'd be back Monday, and to send for him sooner if anything changed. He left a small brown bottle with instructions. He took his bag, and his buggy, and his professionalism, and he went back down the track toward town without once making a comment that Clara would have had to deal with. She appreciated that more than she said. What followed were 3 days that Clara would spend the rest of her life thinking about. Not because they were dramatic in the ways that stories usually required drama. There were no grand moments, no declarations, no scenes that would have looked significant from the outside. What they were was honest, and honesty was its own kind of exposure. She managed the fever through the first night by the oldest method available, which was cold water and persistence, and sitting in the chair beside the settee and dozing upright and waking every hour to check on him, and generally refusing to let the night do what nights sometimes did to people who were already struggling. She was not afraid of physical caretaking. She had some objections to being assumed to exist for the purpose of physical caretaking, but the activity itself was not the problem. The problem was what happened in the spaces between the practical tasks. Silas, when he was lucid enough to talk, talked, not the controlled, cautious Saturday conversations, where you said the thing you'd already thought through and kept the edges trimmed. Fever has a way of burning through that kind of discipline, and by the second night Silas Harrow said things he'd probably spent 4 years successfully not saying. He told her about the morning Evelyn got sick, not the illness itself the morning. That she'd been laughing about something he couldn't remember, something small, and that he hadn't really been listening, and that he'd thought about that moment every single day since, because you don't know which laugh is the last one until it's over, and then you'd give everything you had to have paid better attention. Clara sat in the dark chair and listened, and didn't try to make it better, because it wasn't better, and the people who tried to make it better were the ones who made it worse. I kept the house the same, Silas said. His voice was rough and imprecise with fever, and he was staring at the ceiling the way he'd stared at it while she was cleaning his wound, like there was something up there he was trying to read. I don't know why exactly. I told myself it was practical. It wasn't practical, no, Clara agreed quietly. It was like if I kept it the same, she was still here somewhere. He stopped. Which is not how anything works. No, Clara said again. The shawl's been on that peg for 4 years. She didn't say anything to that. I know how it looks, he said. It looks like a man who loved his wife, Clara said. That doesn't look like anything wrong. He turned his head and looked at her. Even through the fever, she could see him thinking, that careful, deliberate quality he had that she'd first noticed across a market table. You're not what I expected, he said, and it sounded like he hadn't intended to say it. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone who'd tell me to get rid of it. Or tell me it was fine and mean something else. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your wife's shawl, Silas. No, he said. I know that now. He fell asleep maybe 20 minutes later. Clara sat in the dark and thought about Evelyn, whom she had never met and would never meet, and felt again that strange, complicated tenderness that she didn't entirely know what to do with. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't competition. It was more like respect for someone who had occupied a space in a person's life so completely that 4 years of effort hadn't been enough to release it. She thought about what it meant to be loved like that. She thought about whether that kind of love was something Silas Harrow had in him a second time, or whether some people spent it all the first time and came up empty after. She did not think about herself in relation to that question. She was disciplined about it. By the second day, the fever was arguing with itself, going up in the afternoon and dropping in the night, which doctor. Vale had said was normal, and which still made Clara's chest tight every time she pressed her hand to Silas's forehead and felt the heat radiating back. She started cooking because the house needed it, and because it gave her something to do with her hands. And she found the kitchen better stocked than she expected a man who ate seriously, if not elaborately. She made soup because soup was what you made when everything else was uncertain, and she brought it to Silas and sat nearby while he ate it, and they didn't talk much, because they'd done most of their talking during the bad hours, and what was left didn't need to be said yet. His hired men came back Sunday evening, 2 young men named Pete and Caleb, who arrived with the particular sheepish expression of people who have been absent during a crisis they feel responsible for. They were competent and willing, and Clara reorganized them efficiently, which she could see both impressed and slightly startled them. And she sent them off to handle the horses and told Pete that if she needed anything from the barn, she'd ask him directly, which was apparently not how it usually worked, but was how it was going to work now. Caleb, who was maybe 22 and had less self-preservation instinct than Pete, asked her if she was Silas's and then stopped, because something in her expression suggested he should finish that sentence very carefully. I'm someone who happened to be available when there was a problem, Clara said pleasantly. Is that answer clear enough? Yes, ma'am. Caleb said, and went to help Pete with the horses, with the speed of a man who had suddenly remembered he had urgent things to do in another direction. On the third morning, the fever broke. Clara was asleep in the chair, actually asleep, not dozing, which meant she'd let her guard down enough to rest, which told her something about where she was mentally, and she woke to silence. Not the heavy, pressurized silence of the previous nights, but an ordinary silence. She sat up and looked at Silas, and he was looking back at her with clear eyes. Not fever bright. Clear morning, he said. His voice was still rough, but it was his voice, the real one, not the fever version. Clara sat very still for a moment. Something in her chest released that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Morning, she said. You slept in the chair. I slept in the chair. For 3 nights, give or take, Clara said. She stood up, and her back was an entire conversation about what 3 nights in a chair did to a person. She straightened as much as she could and went to put the kettle on. From the other room, Silas said, Clara. Coffee first, she said. A pause. Fair enough. She stood in his kitchen and put the kettle on and looked out the window at the morning coming up over the eastern ridge, pale and cold and absolutely indifferent to what had just happened in the house behind her. She pressed her hands flat on the kitchen counter and breathed for a moment, just breathed, the way you breathe when something is over and you're doing the accounting. 3 days. She had been here 3 days. She had a market table in Red Willow Crossing, with a lease that ran week to week and a loan negotiation she was supposed to be preparing for, and $60 that were now $63, because she'd saved every week since March and none of that had. Stopped while she was here, it had all just been sitting there waiting for her, the way her real life had a habit of doing when she let something pull her sideways. She was not sorry she'd come. She was not sorry she'd stayed. She was extremely unclear about what happened next, and she was a woman who required more clarity than this. She brought the coffee in. Silas had worked himself up to sitting, which was progress. And he took the cup and wrapped both hands around it in the way that meant the fever had left him cold in its wake. You need to eat, Clara said. I'll make something. Clara, sit down a minute. She sat because she recognized the tone. It was the tone from the September Saturday, when he'd stood at her table with 7 miles of arguing with himself still on his face. I want to say thank you, he said, and I want to say it correctly, which means I need a minute. Take your time. You didn't have to come. No. You didn't have to stay. No, but you did. And he stopped. Looked at his coffee. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come when you did. I don't know that I want to know. Clara looked at him steadily. You would have figured something out, maybe. He looked up. But I'm glad I didn't have to. She felt the weight of that in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. Not the gratitude she could manage gratitude. It was the specific way he said it, like her presence wasn't just useful, but was something he had missed the shape of. Like the difference between having someone help you and having a particular someone help you. She looked away, toward the window, and then back. I need to go back tomorrow, she said. Something moved across his face and was gone before she could name it. I know. There are things I need to Clara. I know. He nodded once, carefully. I just stopped. Started again. I'm glad you know the way here now. She looked at him for a long moment. 7 miles south, she said. Left at the Cottonwood. Right at the Cottonwood, he corrected. Right at the Cottonwood. She stood. I'll make breakfast. She went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the stove, and she thought about a shawl on a peg, and a garden gone to weed, and a man with clear eyes who had, for the first time in 4 years maybe, said something that was about the present and not the past. She cracked 4 eggs. She thought about the feed store on Territorial Road, about $63, and a banker who would need convincing, about the lease on a market stall that wouldn't last forever, about the future she had been building carefully, on her own terms, with her name on the door. She put bread onto toast. None of it had changed. The plan was still the plan. She was still the woman who had made herself a promise at 14 and intended to keep it. But something had shifted in the weight of the thing. Some balance she hadn't known was adjustable, and she was going to need a little time and a lot of honest thought to figure out exactly what it meant. The eggs were done. She put them on 2 plates and carried them in, and sat across from Silas Harrow in his quiet house with the shawl on the peg and the garden outside that needed tending and the horses in the corral that were well kept because some things you maintained no matter what else was falling apart, and they ate breakfast together without speaking much, which was its own kind of conversation. Outside, the morning was fully up now, all that pale cold light turning warm and definite over the ridge. Going to be a clear day. Clara finished her eggs and thought, what happens now? And had no answer, and found that she was, cautiously and without much permission, willing to wait and see. That feeling lasted exactly until the following Saturday. When she returned to her market table and set out the bread and the preserves and the pies, and the morning moved through its hours, and Silas Harrow did not appear again. She understood that whatever she had decided to wait and see about was not going to be as simple as she'd let herself briefly believe. And Gerald Pruitt leaned across the stall divide, with his hands in his pockets and his smile, like something that had gone off in the heat, and said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "Told you, Clara. Man like that don't need a woman with notions. He needed a nurse. Now he's better, so." He shrugged, "So," he said again, as if the word itself was the whole argument. Clara looked at him. She looked at the wrapped slice of pie sitting under the table where she'd put it at 9 o'clock, when she'd started admitting to herself she was saving it. She looked at the ridge road south of town, which she could see from here on a clear day if she stood at the right angle. She picked up the pie. She set it on the table in full view. If Silas Harrow was not going to come to her market table, then there were two possibilities. Either he was still unwell, which was a practical problem with a practical solution, or he had decided the distance was too great in ways that had nothing to do with 7 miles on a ridge road. And she was not going to sit here behind a market table and wonder which one it was. She had ridden south once. She could do it again. But this time when she came, she was going to need him to be honest with her. Not fever honest, not the involuntary honesty of a man who had been cornered into vulnerability by a bad leg and 3 nights of high temperature. She was going to need the kind of honesty that costs something, that a person chooses. That means something precisely because the alternative was available, and they didn't take it. She was not going to settle for less than that. She had watched her mother settle. She had spent 34 years building a life specifically so that she would not have to. Clara Whitlock wrapped the pie back up. She put it in her basket. She nodded at Gerald Pruitt in a way that closed the conversation permanently and returned to the business of running her table through the rest of the market day. And she thought, carefully and without sentiment, about exactly what she was going to say when she got back to Iron Mesa Ranch. Because she was going back. The only question was when. She waited 1 more week, not because she was uncertain. Clara Whitlock had stopped being uncertain sometime around the second night in that chair, when she'd understood that the question was not whether she cared about Silas Harrow, but what she intended to do about it, which were 2 very different questions that people confused constantly and to their detriment. No, she waited the extra week because she wanted to be sure she was riding south for the right reasons, and not because Gerald Pruitt had gotten under her skin, which was a thing she refused to allow Gerald Pruitt the satisfaction of doing. So she waited. She baked. She ran her table the following Saturday with the precise focused efficiency of a woman who had decided not to think about something and was succeeding moderately well. She sold out of bread by noon and took 3 orders for pies the following week, and had a long conversation with Mabel Rourke from the dry goods stall about the cost of cinnamon, which had gone up again and was becoming a genuine problem. Mabel Rourke was 61 years old and had been running her stall for longer than Clara had been alive, and she had the particular quality of long-experienced women who say very little but miss nothing. She listened to Clara talk about cinnamon prices, and then she said, "Without preamble, you rode out to the Harrow place." Clara looked at her. "Pete Kemper's boy told his mother," Mabel said serenely. "His mother told the woman who buys eggs from her on Thursdays. It's been 10 days. I'm surprised it took this long to reach you." "Is there something you want to say, Mabel?" "Not particularly." Mabel straightened a stack of folded cloth on her table. "I just wanted you to know the timeline, so you could account for who knows what." Clara considered this. In Red Willow Crossing, information moved the way water moved in spring through every crack available, down every slope, pooling in places you didn't expect. There was no stopping it, only managing what you could. "And what are people saying?" Clara asked, because knowing was better than not knowing. Mabel looked at her with the direct gaze of someone who had decided to tell the truth as a courtesy rather than a kindness. Half the town thinks you've set your sights on Harrow's ranch. The other half thinks he took advantage of your good nature, and you're too stubborn to see it. And what do you think? "I think," Mabel said carefully, "that you're one of the few women in this town who knows exactly what she wants, and I think that frightens people more than they're willing to say." She paused. "I also think Silas Harrow is not a bad man. He's a careful one, which is different." Clara stood with that for a moment. "The cinnamon problem is real, though," Mabel added. "You should try ordering direct from the supply house in Laramie. I can give you the name." That was Monday. By Wednesday, Clara had the name of the Laramie supply house and had written a letter and had made her decision. She was going back to Iron Mesa. Not Saturday. Saturday was too loaded with meaning. Too much of their entire history lived in Saturdays. And she didn't want the conversation she needed to have to feel like a continuation of a pattern. She was going on a Thursday in the middle of the week, like someone making a choice rather than following a routine. Thursday morning, she put on her second-best dress, which was better than her best dress for riding because it had less in the skirt that could get caught on brush. And she told the neighbor's boy to check on her place that evening, and she rode south. The cottonwood, the dry creek, the track up through the grass. The ranch looked better in the morning light than it had the first time she'd seen it, when she'd been too frightened for Silas to see much of anything. The horses in the corral moved well, which she noted with the satisfaction of someone who knew what healthy horses looked like. Someone had started working on the kitchen garden. The worst of the weeds were gone. A rough row or two turned over. Pete came out of the barn when he heard the mule and had the good grace to look unsurprised, which meant he'd been warned or had guessed. "Morning, Miss Whitlock. He's out back." She found Silas at the far end of the property, walking the fence line with a length of wire and a pair of pliers. He was moving on the leg, which was good. He was moving on the leg a little too freely, which was exactly what she would have predicted. He heard her coming and turned, and the expression that crossed his face was complicated relief and guilt, and something guarded underneath both of those. The look of a man who has been expecting something and isn't sure whether to be glad or sorry it's arrived. "Clara, you're walking on it too much," she said. "Good morning to you, too. I mean it, Silas." Vale said a week of rest. That was his word, rest. "It's been nearly 2 weeks. It's been 12 days. He looked at her. "You've been counting." "I've been aware of the timeline," Clara said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him properly, the way she hadn't let herself do at the market table when she was pretending she wasn't waiting for him. He looked better than he had. The gray was gone from his face, and his eyes were clear, and there was color under the tan again. He'd shaved, which suggested either that he was feeling well or that he'd known she was coming, and she suspected both. "You didn't come to the market," she said. "No. 2 Saturdays. "I know, Silas." She kept her voice even. "I need you to tell me why." He set the wire down on the nearest fence post. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, the way he did when he was deciding how honest to be, and then he looked back at her. "Because I didn't know how to come and stand at your table and pretend that the last 3 weeks were that it was just the same as before." He paused. "And I didn't know what else to do. So you did nothing." "I did nothing," he agreed. He said it plainly, without defending it, which she gave him credit for. "That wasn't the right choice. I know that too." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The sun was fully up now, and the ranch was going about its business around them. The horses moving in the corral, Pete doing something in the barn that required occasional hammering, a meadowlark going on and on from a fence post 20 yards east. Ordinary morning, the kind of ordinary that existed on both sides of moments that changed things. "I'm not here to push you into something," she said. "I need you to understand that before we go any further. I have my own plans. I have my own life. I'm not at your fence line this morning because I need something from you or because I'm hoping I'm not here for any of that." "I know," Silas said quietly. "I'm here because she started again, because she had promised herself she'd say this correctly. I rode 7 miles to check on you 2 weeks ago and spent 3 nights in a chair and then went home and went back to my life as planned. And I was prepared to leave it there. But you didn't come Saturday, and then you didn't come the next Saturday, and I am not willing to sit at my table and turn that into a story I tell myself about why it's fine." He was very still. "I want to know what's happening in your head," Clara said. "That's all. I'm not asking for a promise or a plan. I'm asking for the truth." The hammering from the barn stopped. The meadowlark moved on to a different post. Silas looked at her with the expression he'd had on that first September Saturday, the man who had argued with himself the whole 7 miles and hadn't quite won. Except this time, she thought, the argument had been going on for 2 weeks and he was exhausted from it. "I'm afraid," he said. It was so direct that it almost surprised her. Of what, specifically? Of he picked up the wire, looked at it, set it down again. "When Evelyn died, I thought I told myself I was done. With that, with all of it. Not as punishment, just it felt like the honest thing to say. You only had so much of that kind of feeling, and I'd spent mine." He stopped. "And then I stood at your table for 8 months and realized that might not have been as true as I thought." Clara kept her face steady, and that scared me, he said. "Because wanting something again means you can lose it again." And he paused on that for a long moment. I didn't know if I was built for that a second time. It was the most he'd said in a conversation that wasn't driven by fever, and Clara heard the cost of it in every word. Quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I lost my father at 16. I watched my mother rebuild everything from nothing and then have it matter to everyone except herself because her name wasn't on any of it." She looked at him steadily. "I've been afraid of things my entire adult life, Silas. I've been afraid of the bank, and afraid of what this town would say, and afraid that I'd turn around at 60 and have nothing that was mine. I have been afraid every single day for 6 years." She paused. "I baked bread anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not a small thing," he said. "No," Clara said. "It's not." The silence between them was different from the ones before, not uncomfortable, not pressurized. More like two people standing on the same piece of ground and finally looking at it honestly. "I want to keep coming to your table," Silas said. "If you'll have me, I'll have you at my table," Clara said. Same as before. Something in his posture changed relief, she thought, and also something more complicated that she wasn't going to press on today. They had time. The season was still good, and the summer was long, and she had learned, somewhere in the past 2 weeks, that not everything needed to be resolved in a single conversation. She picked up the wire from the fence post. "Show me where it's broken." He blinked. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Clara said. "Show me where it's broken." So he showed her, and they walked the fence line together. The Thursday morning, not talking about anything in particular, the horses, the condition of the upper pasture, the cost of winter feed if the hay harvest came in short. Ordinary talk, the kind of talk that meant something precisely because of what it was resting on top of. The following Saturday, Silas was at her table at 9 o'clock. She had saved the end piece. She put it on the cloth in front of him without saying anything about it, and he looked at it and then looked at her, and she went back to helping another customer, and that was that. The market moved around them, and Gerald Pruitt made a point of not looking in their direction, and Clara sold everything on her table by early afternoon, and it was, in almost every visible way, exactly the same as it had been before. Except it wasn't, and they both knew it, and that was fine. August moved into September. September carried the smell of coming winter in the mornings, that particular cold earth sharpness that meant you had maybe 6 weeks before the world locked up, and everything became about survival and maintenance until spring. The market would close in October. Clara had done her counting, and she was still about $40 short of where she wanted to be before approaching the bank. And the Laramie supply connection Mabel had given her might save her $8 to $12 over the winter if she managed the ordering right, but it required capital she didn't have yet for the initial order. She was working through this on a Tuesday evening when she heard a knock at her door. Nobody knocked on her door on Tuesday evenings. She opened it, and Silas was standing on her step, hat in his hand, and he looked like a man who had ridden 7 miles specifically to say something and was now reconsidering every decision that had led him here. "Silas." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." "I won't stay long," he said, which was what people said when they were about to stay longer than they planned. He came in and stood in her front room looking at the papers on her kitchen table. She'd been doing her accounting and then looking at her. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's generally visible on you," Clara said. "Sit down." He sat. She put the kettle on because it gave her something to do with her hands and waited. "I want to say something," Silas said, "and I want to say it right." And I know I don't always say things right on the first try, so I want you to. If I say it wrong, I need you to tell me." Clara turned from the stove. All right. He was looking at his hat, turning it by the brim in the way he did when he was working something out. "You've been talking about that feed store for as long as I've been buying pie. And I've been listening." He looked up. "And I've been noticing how you talk about it. Not the way people talk about a dream they're not sure about. The way people talk about something that's already real in their head, and they're just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up." Clara was quiet. "I went by it last week," he said. She stilled the feed store. "I just walked past." "I wasn't," he stopped. "I just looked at it. The window's worse than you described. The roof over the east corner has maybe one more winter in it if you're lucky, and the winter is mild." He met her eyes. "But the bones are good. The walls are straight. The floor in the main room is solid under the water damage. I've worked on enough buildings to know the difference between a problem and a fatal problem." Clara sat down across from him because her legs had made a decision without consulting the rest of her. "Why did you go look at it?" she asked. "Because I wanted to know if it was real," Silas said. If it was something that could work. "Not the idea of it, the actual building. And it's real," he said simply. "It's a lot of work, and the east corner's going to cost money you probably don't have, but it's real." She looked at him across her kitchen table with the accounting papers between them and the kettles starting to make noise behind her, and she thought about a man who had ridden 7 miles on a Tuesday evening to tell her that her dream was structurally sound. She thought about all the things that sentence contained and didn't contain, the careful way it was framed, the things left unsaid. "Silas," she said slowly, "why are you telling me this tonight?" He set the hat down on the table. "Because I want to help." "I don't," he stopped. Tried again. "I've been trying to figure out how to say that I want to be useful to you without making it sound like I think you need me to be. Because you don't. And I know that, and I don't want to say it wrong." Kettle was fully going now. Clara got up and dealt with it because she needed 30 seconds to herself, and she stood at the stove and poured the water and thought about a man who was trying very hard to offer something without making it into a debt. She brought the cups back and sat down. "Here's what I hear when you say that," she said. "Tell me if I'm wrong. You want to be part of something that matters to me. You're just not sure how to do that without it looking like you're taking over." He looked at her steadily. "That's exactly it. Then here's what I'll say back." Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. "I'm going to do this myself. I'm going to walk into that bank, and I'm going to negotiate the loan, and I'm going to sign papers with my name on them and nobody else's. Part isn't negotiable." "I know," he said, and he said it like he meant it. "But there's a difference," Clara continued, "between doing something yourself and doing it alone. And I've been confusing those two things for long enough that I've gotten used to the confusion." She looked at him. "If you want to help me fix a roof, Silas, that's a different conversation than trying to own half my bakery." Something in his face shifted relief again, but cleaner this time, without the guilt underneath it. "I'm better with a hammer than I probably look," he said. "Don't doubt it," Clara said. "But I'm not at the hammer stage yet. I'm still at the $40 short of feeling safe enough to walk into the bank stage." Silas looked at the accounting papers on the table. "Can I look at those?" She hesitated. He said quietly, "I'm not going to tell you what to do with your own numbers. I just want to see what you're working with." She turned the papers so he could see them. He looked at them for a long time. He asked 2 questions, both of them specific and practical, and she answered both, and he nodded, and then he pointed at a line she'd been worried about and said there was a supplier in Casper whose winter prices were lower than what she'd quoted herself, and he could tell her the contact name if she wanted it. She wrote it down. He didn't offer money. She noted this carefully. He offered a contact name, which was information, which was different. And then he turned the papers back toward her and picked up his coffee and said nothing else about it. They sat in her kitchen for another hour, talking about things that weren't the bakery and the accounting and the feed store on Territorial Road. The Kemper family's new horse, which had a bad habit. Whether October was likely to come early this year based on how the birds were moving. The bread order she'd taken from the school teacher who was new in town and didn't know yet how to manage a frontier kitchen. Ordinary things. Silas left when the evening got late, and Clara stood at her door and watched him ride back toward the ridge road and thought about what her life had looked like 6 months ago and what it looked like now, and whether. Those two pictures were as different as they felt. The accounting on her table said $40 short. The contact name in Casper might move that number. She went back inside and picked up her pencil. October came on schedule. The market closed. The letters went out Casper, Laramie, one to a woman in Cheyenne that Mabel had connected her with who knew something about ovens. Clara baked through the winter the way she always had, selling through the informal network of neighbors and the general store sort counter, keeping the numbers moving. Silas came on Tuesdays sometimes, not every Tuesday, not predictably enough to become an expectation, but often enough that she stopped being surprised when she heard the mule at the fence. They had dinner sometimes just coffee, and the conversations went where they went, which was mostly practical and sometimes not. He told her once over coffee in November that he'd been out to the feed store again. She put her cup down. "You're going to tell me the roof got worse." "The roof got a little worse," he confirmed. "The east corner." "But I was right about the bones, Silas. I wasn't measuring anything," he said. "I just walked around it. You measured something," Clara said. A pause. "I may have had a length of rope in my pocket." She looked at him. "For entirely innocent reasons," he said. She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling, which was getting harder to do with any consistency around this man. "And what did the entirely innocent rope tell you?" "That the doorway into the main room is wider than you thought. Wide enough for two people side by side, which matters for how you'd think about the counter placement." Clara looked at the table. The counter placement was something she'd been thinking about for 6 years. She had opinions about it. She had sketches of it, rough ones, on the back of an old market ledger. "The north wall," she said. "Not the east. You want the light from the east window on the workspace, not on the selling space." "I was thinking the north wall too," he said. She looked up. He was looking back at her with that careful expression, the one that did not take anything for granted. And she thought about a man who had taken a rope to a building because he wanted to understand a woman's plans, and not because he intended to alter them. That winter was the longest she could remember, not in duration, but in the particular fullness of it, the sense of so many things happening underneath the surface of the ordinary days. She finished the winter $14 closer to the number she needed, which was better than any previous winter, and when she wrote down the final figure in March and looked at it, she allowed herself 1 full minute of sitting at her kitchen table doing nothing except being aware that this was almost real. Almost. Not yet. That March, on a Thursday that felt like the middle of everything and the beginning of something, Clara put on her coat and walked down Territorial Road and stood across from the feed store and looked at it for a long time. The front window was still broken. The swallows were back in the eaves. The east corner of the roof had a definite sag that hadn't been there in the fall, or maybe it had been and she hadn't wanted to see it. The walls were straight. Silas had said the bones were good. She crossed the road. She walked up to the door, which wasn't locked, which was either an oversight or an invitation depending on how you looked at it, and she pushed it open and went inside for the first time. The smell hit her first old wood, dust, something that might have been grain from its previous life, and underneath it, all the particular cold of a building that had been empty through a Montana winter. Her footsteps were loud in the empty space. The light came in from the west window, long and pale and spring-thin, and fell across the floor in a shape that told her exactly where the counter should go. North wall. She stood in the middle of the main room for a long time. The floor was soft in one corner. Like Silas had said, south corner. Not east, and she'd need to know what was under it. The ceiling height was good, better than good. A woman could move through this space without feeling cramped, and the width of the front room was enough for 3 or 4 people waiting without anyone crowding anyone else. She walked to the back room, which was smaller and darker and smelled more strongly of grain. and she stood in the doorway and thought about where the ovens would go and how the smoke would vent and whether the wall between the two rooms was load-bearing or not, which was a question she didn't know the answer to and would need to find out. She needed to find out a great many things. About the ownership of the building, which she knew only vaguely, and about the price, which she'd heard numbers for but not confirmed, and about the terms the bank would offer a woman applying a loan, which she expected would require 3 times the documentation of a man applying in the same circumstances. She knew all of this. Standing in the back room of an empty feed store in the cold March light, she was not afraid of any of it. She was afraid of exactly one thing. She was afraid that if she told Silas she was ready to go to the bank, he would do something that was meant as kindness but would land as something else. She'd seen it happen to women she knew. A man who meant well, who said the right things, who genuinely wanted to help, and then somewhere between intention and action, he would say, or do the thing that made the whole project feel like his. She could not let that happen. She would not let that happen. But she also, standing in the cold and the dust with the west light on the floor, she also wanted to tell him. She wanted to tell him she was standing in the building. She wanted to tell him the north wall was exactly right for the counter. She wanted him to know this was happening, and that she had done it herself, and she wanted him to be glad about it. Those two things, the wariness and the wanting, sat in her chest simultaneously, and she stood with them until she got cold enough that she had to move. She walked back out and pulled the door shut behind her. She stood on the step for a moment and looked up at the eaves where the swallows were building their nest, industrious and unconcerned with her. Right, she thought. She walked down the step. She went home. She got out the ledger with the rough sketches on the back, and she turned to a clean page, and she started drawing the counter on the north wall, the ovens in the back, the shelf system on the east side where the light would catch the bread. And she drew it precisely and without apology and with all the years of knowing her own mind behind every line. Then she went to write a letter to the Red Willow Territorial Bank, requesting an appointment to discuss a business loan for the purposes of commercial property acquisition and establishment of a sole proprietorship under the name of Clara Whitlock. She used good paper. She had been saving it. She sealed the letter. She would take it to the post tomorrow. And she would tell Silas on Saturday when he came for his pie, because he was coming on Saturday. She was certain of it. And she was going to look him in the eye and say, "I'm ready." And she was going to say it herself in her own words, on her own terms. She blew out the lamp. In the dark kitchen, she sat for a moment, listening to the March wind do what March wind did in this part of the country, which was remind you that spring was a promise and not yet a fact. She was tired. She was also, underneath the tired, something that she almost didn't trust because it had been a long time since she'd felt it this clearly. She was ready. The letter went to the bank on a Friday. Clara hand-delivered it rather than leaving it at the post because she wanted to know it arrived and because she wanted to see the face of the man behind the counter when he read the words sole proprietorship and Clara Whitlock in the same sentence. His name was Henderson, and he was 40-something, and wore a mustache that he seemed to believe conveyed authority. He read the letter with the careful neutrality of a man deciding how to respond to something he hadn't anticipated. "We'll be in touch," he said. "I'll expect to hear by Wednesday," Clara said. Not a question. Henderson looked at her over the letter. "These things take time, Miss Whitlock. I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that you turned around a loan application for the Greer brothers in 4 days last October, and their collateral was a mule and a handshake." She smiled pleasantly. "Wednesday works well for me." She left before he could answer. She did not tell Silas about the letter that Saturday. She had intended to. She had rehearsed it, in fact, a plain and honest version of it. "I wrote to the bank. I'm going in for the loan. Simple. True, the kind of thing you told someone you trusted when something important was happening." But Silas arrived at her table that Saturday morning with something on his face that she couldn't read. A particular quality of tension in the way he stood that was different from the usual careful deliberateness. And before she could say anything about the letter, he said, "Can I talk to you?" "Not here." After the market, she looked at him. "All right." So they waited through the market hours, Clara selling, and Silas standing somewhat uselessly near the edge of her table, doing the thing where he pretended to look at the middle distance while actually watching her manage customers, which she had noticed months ago and chosen not to comment on. The market thinned out by early afternoon. Clara packed the table in the methodical way she always did. Cloth folded first, then the empty trays, then the cash box. "Walk with me," Silas said. They walked down Territorial Road, which was the natural direction from the market, and also the direction of the feed store, a fact that Clara noted and filed without comment. It was a good April afternoon, the kind that made people believe spring was serious this time, and the road was busy enough that their walking together wouldn't be remarkable. They passed the feed store. Clara watched Silas from the corner of her eye and saw him not look at it, which was the most pointed form of looking at something. They reached the end of the road where it turned toward the creek, and the cottonwood trees were just starting to think about leaves. And Silas stopped and looked at the water for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something," he said, without saying it wrong. "You said that last time," Clara pointed out. "In my kitchen." "I know," he turned to face her. "Last time it was about the bakery. This time it's about—" He stopped. "Try it again. This time it's about us." The word landed quietly between them. Clara kept her face steady, which required some effort. "All right," she said. "I know how this goes wrong," Silas said. He said it with the directness of someone who had thought about it long enough that the careful phrasing had finally burned away and left just the thing itself. "I know what it looks like when a man who lost his wife starts spending time with a woman who's capable and present and in good. I know what it looks like from outside, and I know what it can turn into, where the man thinks he's found something when really he's just filling a space. And I've been asking myself every week for the past 6 months whether that's what I'm doing." Clara was very quiet. "And the answer," Silas, is no. "It's not what I'm doing." He looked at her with the full, direct attention that she'd noticed from the very beginning, that quality of genuinely seeing the person in front of him rather than the idea of them. "I know the difference between lonely and this is not lonely." She let a moment pass. "What is it?" she asked. He looked briefly at the creek. "It's you specifically, Clara. It's the way you argued with Henderson before I could even get out a word, which I'm guessing is what you did when you left that letter." She blinked. "You knew about the letter," Mabel told me, he said simply. "On Thursday, she thought I should know." A pause. "I think she was checking whether I'd do something stupid." "Did you?" "I didn't do anything," he said, "because it wasn't mine to do. That letter was yours." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The creek made its noise, and a bird somewhere was working hard at something, and the cottonwoods dropped the first small shadows of real leaves across the road. "You knew since Thursday," she said, "and you didn't say anything until now." "I was trying to say it right," he said, with a faint, rueful quality she hadn't heard from him before. "I've been practicing." She felt something move in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely yet. "Say the rest of it," she said. He nodded once, the way he did when he was accepting the terms of something. "I want to court you. Properly. Not—" He stopped at whatever expression crossed her face. "Not in the way that means I'm going to ride 7 miles every Saturday and buy pie and call that courtship, because we're past that. And not in the way where I decide we're courting and start making decisions like that's already settled." He reached into his coat pocket. Clara watched his hand come out with a small piece of folded paper. "I wrote it down," he said almost apologetically, "so I wouldn't get it wrong." She stared at the paper for a second. Something shifted in the back of her throat. "You wrote a speech," she said. "It's not a speech. It's notes." He looked at the paper and then looked at her and put it back in his pocket. "I'll just say it. I want to spend time with you that we both choose, not just time that happens because I show up. I want to know about the bakery, not because I can help fix the east corner, which I can, but because it matters to you, and I want to know what matters to you. And I want—" He paused. "I want you to still be exactly who you are, because that's the whole point. That's what I—" He stopped himself. "It's not saying this as well as the paper," he said. Clara pressed her lips together hard. She was not going to do something undignified in the middle of Territorial Road with the cottonwoods just coming into leaf. She was not. You're saying it fine, she said. I just don't want you to think. Silas. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to say something now, and I need you to hear it completely before you respond. He went quiet. I have spent a long time, Clara said, being careful, about what I let in and what I kept out, and I've had good reasons for all of it, and I don't apologize for any of it. She met his eyes. But I also know the difference between being careful and being closed. And I've been bumping up against that line since September, and I'd like to stop bumping up against it. He waited. Yes, she said, a beat. Yes to the courtship, she said clearly. Yes to choosing it. Yes, she gestured slightly, whatever that paper says. He exhaled. It was such a human sound, such a genuinely relieved exhale that Clara felt the last held thing in her own chest release to match it. Paper mostly said the same things, he said. I assumed. They stood by the creek in the April afternoon, and neither of them said anything for a minute or two, which was fine. Some moments didn't need filling. The water moved. The cottonwoods considered their leaves. Clara thought about how strange it was to feel simultaneously completely certain and completely terrified, and how that combination was probably the most honest feeling she'd had in years. The bank appointment is Wednesday, she said eventually. I know. I'm going alone. I know that too, he said. And he said it without any texture of disappointment, just acknowledgement of a fact that was correct. She nodded. All right then. Wednesday came gray and cold, as April Wednesdays in Montana had a habit of doing, like the month was apologizing for the optimism of the weekend. Clara put on her best dress, the one that was less good for riding but better for Banks' dark wool. Clean collar, the appearance of someone who had not spent the morning worrying about the east corner of a building's roof. She had her documents in a leather satchel that had been her father's, which was the closest thing she owned to an heirloom, and which she considered a reasonable thing to carry into a bank when asking to be taken seriously. Henderson was ready for her, which told her he'd been warned she wasn't going to be put off. His office was small and warm and had a picture of someone's cattle operation on the wall that he probably thought projected confidence in agricultural lending. He sat across from her and opened a folder, and Clara sat with her back straight and her hands folded and the satchel on her knee and waited. The questions started reasonably. Annual income from the market operation. Current debts, of which there were small ones from the bad season, now nearly cleared. Savings on hand. She answered all of them with the numbers she had in her head, which were accurate to the dollar. Then Henderson said, "And you're applying as sole proprietor?" That's what the letter said. No cosigner. No cosigner. Miss Whitlock. He leaned back in his chair in the way that men leaned back when they were about to say something they expected to have to defend. A commercial property loan for a woman operating independently, the board is going to want to see additional security. It's not personal. It's the bank's exposure. Clara looked at him. What additional security? A male guarantor, family member, or... No, Clara said. Henderson blinked. The numbers I've given you represent 6 years of solo operation with a clean record, Clara said. I've shown you 3 years of market ledgers and 2 years of savings history. I have a supplier agreement from Casper and a letter of intended purchase from the property owner. She had gotten that letter 2 weeks ago, quietly, without mentioning it to anyone, including Silas. If those numbers don't justify the loan on their own merits, I'd like to know which specific number is the problem. If the problem is not a number but a name, then I'd like you to say so plainly so we're both clear on what's happening here. Henderson's mustache moved in a way that suggested he was recalibrating. The board meets Thursday, he said. I'll expect to hear Friday, Clara said. She got up. She shook his hand. She walked out of the bank into the cold gray Wednesday with her father's satchel and her heart going considerably faster than she would have preferred. And she stood on the step for a moment, breathing the cold air until the adrenaline settled into something she could manage. Then she walked home and sat at her kitchen table and did not look at the accounting papers and did not calculate the numbers again, because she had calculated them enough times that doing it again would only be fear pretending to be preparation. She baked bread instead. She was on her second loaf when the knock came. She knew before she opened the door that it was Silas, because it was a Tuesday in the evening. and she'd apparently trained herself to some kind of Silas-specific pattern recognition without fully realizing it. He was on her step with his hat in his hand and an expression she couldn't read in the dark. "You've already heard," she said. "Mabel saw you coming out of the bank," he said. "How did it go?" "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat at her table. She put flour-covered bread on the table because that was what was available, and poured water from the pitcher, and then sat down across from him. She told him exactly how it went. The questions the guarantor demand, what she'd said, what Henderson said after. She told it flatly and without dramatics, because that was how it was, and she wasn't interested in performing distress. She wasn't entirely sure she felt yet. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a moment. "You said no," he said. "To the guarantor, yes." "Good." She looked at him. "Clara, you don't need a guarantor," he said, with a certainty that surprised her. "Your numbers are solid. Henderson is testing how far he can push. If you'd said yes, he'd have had the upper hand on every term that followed." He paused. "I've dealt with that man twice. He doesn't actually want to say no to a loan that's going to perform. He wants you to think he might, so you come in smaller." Stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because he did it to me when I bought the North parcel," Silas said. "Asked me for a co-signer when I had more than enough collateral. I said no. He approved the loan in a week." Clara sat with this. "You should have told me," she said. "You didn't ask me about Henderson," he said simply. "You asked me about the building. I answered what you asked." She thought about being annoyed at that logic and found she couldn't quite manage it because it was exactly what she would have done. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he agreed. He didn't say it was going to be fine. He didn't tell her not to worry. He sat at her table and ate her bread, and they talked about other things. And he left at a reasonable hour. And Clara went to bed and slept better than she had all week, which told her something she decided to think about later. Friday came. A letter arrived in the early afternoon. Clara opened it at her kitchen table. She read it once. She set it down. She read it again. The board had approved the loan, contingent on standard terms and a first payment structure beginning in June. The interest rate was higher than she'd hoped and lower than she'd feared, and the repayment schedule was aggressive but workable if the bakery did what she believed it could do in the first year. Her name was at the top of the approval letter. Just her name, no one else's. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not doing anything, just sitting with the letter in front of her, and the afternoon light moving across the floor, and the very specific, very quiet feeling of something you've been building toward for 6 years becoming actual. She thought about her mother. She thought about 31 years of a market table and a name on nothing. She thought about flour in your hands and food in other people's mouths, and how those things were real and good, and also at the same time not enough. She thought about the promise she'd made herself at 14, and what it cost to keep it, and what it would have cost not to. She didn't cry. She'd expected to, maybe. She sat with the letter and felt the weight of it, and it was heavy, in the way good things are heavy, not crushing but solid, the weight of something that actually exists. Then she put on her coat and walked to the feed store. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't unlocked today. The property owner had given her a key with the letter of intent, and she used it and stood in the main room in the afternoon light and breathed the cold grain and dust smell. This was going to be hers, not borrowed, not leased week to week, not contingent on a man's permission or a town's approval, or how agreeable she could make herself. Hers, with her name on the deed, paid for with 6 years of early mornings and flour in her hair and numbers that she had worked until they worked. She walked to the north wall and put her hand flat against the wood. The plank was solid under her palm, cold from the winter still in it, but solid, the bones good like Silas had said. She stood there for a while. Then she heard footsteps on the step outside, and the door opened and Silas came in. And for a second she just looked at him, standing in the doorway of her building with the afternoon behind him, and she thought, of course he came. Not because she'd called him, or because anyone had told him he'd just known, or guessed, or followed the same logic she would have followed if their positions were reversed. "Mabel," Clara said. "I was at the post," he said. "I happened to see the postman's route. A beat. I wasn't following you." You were a little bit following me. I was a little bit following you, he admitted without apparent shame. She turned back to the north wall. The counter goes here. She heard him come further into the room. He stopped behind her, not too close, and looked at the wall. Long side along this run, he said. You want about 8 feet? 10, Clara said. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it at the right size. 10 it is. He looked up at the ceiling, assessing. The east corner of the roof is going to need to come off before you can do anything else. You'll want to do that before you put the floor in. I know, I can have Pete and Caleb out here. Silas stopped. She turned around and looked at him. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hat in his hand and his eyes moving around the space the way they moved around the north parcel when he was calculating what it would take that particular. Focused attention that was more action than looking. I got the loan, she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was warmer than one. I know. My name only, she said. I know. I'm going to need help with the building work, she said. And I am willing to accept that help, and I'm not going to be foolish about it and do everything alone when there are people who know what they're doing and are offering. But I need you to hear something. He waited. When this is done, Clara said, and there's a sign over that door, and it says Whitlock Bakery. I need that to mean what it means. I need people to walk in here and know that I built this. Not that someone helped me build this, not that I had a man behind me making it possible. She looked at him steadily. I need it to be mine in the way that Iron Mesa is yours completely, without asterisks. Yes, he said. That means Clara, he said quietly. I understand what it means. I understood it in September when you first told me about this building. I understood it in November when I came with a rope in my pocket. He met her eyes. I'm not trying to own any part of this. I'm trying to be useful to someone who knows what she's doing and isn't too proud to let me help on her terms. A pause. Those are different things. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold light of her building. They are different things, she said finally. Yes. All right, Clara said. She turned back to the north wall. The floor comes first. I need to know what's under the soft corner before I order lumber. I can pull that board up tomorrow if you want. I want, she said. He nodded. She heard him moving around the space, pacing it the way he did when he was forming a picture of something. And she stood at the north wall with her hand on the wood and thought about 10 feet of counter and the right shelving system and what it would smell like in here when the ovens were going. She thought about her mother. She thought about her mother, and then she let the thought go. Not because it was painful, though it was, but because she had the thing her mother never had, and holding the comparison too long would make her feel guilty for something that wasn't her fault, and she didn't have time for guilt right now. She had a building to fix. Silas, she said, still here. The window, the east one. Is it worth repairing, or do I need to replace the whole frame? He came and stood beside her and looked at the window, and she looked at the window, and they both looked at it together in the manner of two people who have gotten comfortable enough to stand close to something and consider it jointly without anyone feeling crowded. Frames warped on the bottom left corner, he said. You could sister a new piece onto it and save the rest. He tilted his head. It's a few hours' work, not a replacement. Good, Clara said. That's $6 I'd rather put toward the oven. What are you looking at for an oven? She told him. He knew someone in Cheyenne who dealt in commercial baking equipment and had better prices than the supply houses. She took the name. They stood in the empty room and talked about the building the way she'd once talked about it to herself in the dark. Running the numbers and the order of operations and the problem of the east corner roof and what grade of lumber made sense for the floor and how long it would take and whether she'd be open by July or whether August was more realistic. It felt different, talking about it out loud to someone who was listening like it mattered. Not better than planning alone, exactly. Different. Like a thing becoming more real because another person could see it too. The afternoon light shifted and the room got colder, and eventually they ran out of specific things to talk about and stood in the quiet for a moment. I should get back, Silas said. Pete's handling the evening feed, but I don't like leaving him alone with the roan much past dark. The roan still being difficult? The roan is always going to be difficult, he said, with the weary affection of a man who had accepted an unreasonable animal into his life and wasn't sorry about it, just occasionally useful. Clara almost said something about the parallel. She kept it to herself. They walked out. Clara locked the door behind her with her key, and she stood on the step for a moment, feeling the weight of the key in her hand, which was not especially heavy but felt like it should be. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for not making me feel bad about it," Silas said. She looked at him in the late afternoon. He was already moving toward his horse, hat in hand, and she watched him go with the feeling she'd been accumulating since September, the one she'd been very precise and careful about not naming. "Silas," he turned. "Come for dinner Thursday," she said. "Not Tuesday, Thursday. I'll cook something that isn't bread." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll come Thursday." She went home. She sat at her kitchen table and pulled out the ledger with the sketches on the back, and she turned to the page where she'd drawn the counter on the north wall, and she added details she hadn't thought of until today. The placement of the bread shelves, the height of the counter for someone working long hours. The second window she'd need to add on the west side if the light turned out to be insufficient. Then she turned to a new page and wrote at the top, in her cleanest hand, Whitlock Bakery. Opening summer 1889. She looked at it for a long time. Downstairs, the spring wind pushed against the house in the way spring wind did testing. Not committed, as if it wasn't sure yet whether to be warm or cold and was taking its time deciding. Clara picked up her pencil again. There was still the east corner to plan for, and the oven to price out, and a June 1st payment already circled on her calendar. And the question of how to tell Mabel Rourke before Mabel found out through the post again, and the long, complicated business of turning an empty feed store into a thing that belonged to her. She had work to do. She bent over the page, and somewhere in the back of her mind, in the place she'd been keeping things, she wasn't ready to examine yet, the word Thursday sat quietly and waited for her to be done with the rest of it. Thursday dinner became a thing. Not every Thursday, and not announced as such, it emerged the way most real things emerge between two careful people, gradually and without a formal declaration. Until one day, Clara realized she'd started planning the menu on Wednesday evenings without noticing the habit had formed. She cooked things that weren't bread as she'd promised. Silas ate them with the focused appreciation of a man who had been cooking for himself for 4 years and had developed strong opinions about what it meant to have someone else do it occasionally. He always brought something firewood once, a jar of honey from a farm near the South Ridge, twice a piece of hardware she needed for the building work that he'd picked up in town without making a production of it. He never stayed past 9, she noticed that too. Like he was being careful not to become a fixture before he'd been invited to be one, and she respected the discipline of it even when. Some Thursdays, 9 o'clock came, and the conversation was still in the middle of something. The building work started in earnest in May. Pete and Caleb came 3 days a week, which was what Silas could spare from the ranch during the busy season, and what Clara could manage alongside the market table. She was out there with them most days. Not standing back and supervising, but working pulling nails, stacking lumber, making decisions about which boards could be saved and which needed replacing, because no one knew better than she did what she needed and where. Pete had initially directed his questions to Silas. By the second week, he'd learned to direct them to Clara, partly because she answered faster, and partly because Silas consistently redirected him back to her with a patience that Clara watched and quietly stored away as evidence of something. The east corner of the roof was as bad as they'd feared, and worse in one specific place where the rot had gone further into the rafter than was visible from outside. Silas pulled the section apart on a Tuesday morning and stood looking at it with the expression of a man recalculating, and Clara came to stand beside him and look at it too. "How much worse?" she said. 3 extra rafters, maybe 4. And you'll want to replace the sheathing on the whole east side while it's open, or you'll have this problem again in 5 years. He looked at her. "That's another, I'd say, $30 in materials, maybe more if lumber prices hold where they are." Clara stood with that number. $30 was not the $30 of a year ago. The loan had given her a working budget. but it was a tight one, designed around the minimum necessary to open and maintain a first-year payment schedule. $30 unplanned dollars was $30 she didn't have a line for. "Can we do the sheathing ourselves?" she said. "Yes. That saves the labor cost. And if I source the lumber from the Kemper mill instead of the town yard?" Thought about it. Maybe 10% cheaper. They'd have to cut to length, which takes a few days. "I'll talk to Kemper." She looked at the open roof. "Do it right. I'm not coming back up there in 5 years." "I wasn't going to suggest otherwise," Silas said. She went to the Kemper mill that afternoon. She negotiated the price herself, shook hands herself, and arranged delivery herself, and came back to the building site with a timeline and a number that was $22 instead of $30, which she considered a reasonable outcome for an afternoon's work. She told Silas the number when he came by the next morning. He looked at her, and then at the order receipt she handed him, and then back at her. "That's a good price, I know," Clara said. "How'd you manage it?" "I told Kemper I'd buy all my flour sacks from his wife's dry goods operation for the first year if he met my number." She took the receipt back. "She has better prices than Pruitt anyway. It works out." Silas made a sound that was as close to delighted as she'd ever heard from him. "You traded future business for present lumber pricing." "I traded a certainty I was going to have anyway for a certainty I needed now," Clara said. "It's not complicated." "No," Silas said, "it's not. It's just smart." She went back to pulling nails and didn't make anything of the compliment, which was the correct way to handle it, and also required some active effort. The floor came out entirely in the soft corner, as she'd expected, and what was underneath was not terrible. The joists were sound. Just the boards above them had gone. New planks went in over the course of a week, Pete doing most of the cutting while Clara and Caleb laid and nailed, and Silas worked alongside them on his days out from the ranch. He worked without needing direction, which she appreciated, and he had the quality of useful people on a work site who don't talk much but don't disappear either. One afternoon in the third week of May, when Pete and Caleb had gone back to the ranch for evening chores, and Clara and Silas were the only ones left, she was finishing the last run of nails along the new floorboards, and he was doing something to the window frame on the east side, the sistered repair he'd mentioned, and the building was quiet except for the sounds of their work. The late afternoon light came in from the west and fell across the new wood floor, and Clara sat back on her heels and looked at it. It was real, not a sketch on the back of a ledger, not a number in an accounting column. Real wood under her hands, real nails, real floor that she was going to stand on every morning, for as long as this business lasted, and she had made it happen with her own decisions and her own money and her own hands, with help she had chosen to accept on terms she had set. She became aware that the hammering from the window had stopped. She looked up. Silas was standing with his back to the wall, watching her, and he had the expression she'd seen on him occasionally, and had never quite known what to do with something open and uncomplicated in a man who was usually neither. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just watching you figure out you did it." She looked at the floor. She looked at him. She looked at the floor again. "I haven't done it yet," she said. "The oven isn't in. Counter isn't built. I haven't, Clara." She stopped. "You did it," he said simply. She pressed her lips together and went back to the last few nails, and she hit them harder than was strictly necessary, and she did not think about the fact that her eyes were doing something she refused to acknowledge. The oven arrived from Cheyenne in early June, which was later than planned and cost more to freight than she'd quoted herself, which meant the first payment to the bank was tighter than she liked. She made the payment. She ate simpler meals than usual for 2 weeks, and she didn't tell Silas about the tighter margin, because it wasn't his problem to solve, and it was a gap she could manage. She managed it. The counter went in during the second week of June. Silas built it himself. Over 3 days, from the planking she'd specified 10 feet, north wall, the right height for someone working long hours, with a lower shelf below the surface for trays and a railing along the front edge that was his addition, practical and unassuming, that she hadn't thought of and immediately recognized as correct. She ran her hand along the top when it was finished. The wood was smooth and even, the joints tight. "It's good work," she said. "It'll hold," he said. She looked at him. It's good work, Silas. He looked at the counter. Thank you. They hung the sign on the last Friday of June. Clara had commissioned it from the woodworker at the edge of town, a man named Fitch, who was expensive and worth it. And when the cart arrived with the painted board, she stood on the step of her building and read what it said. Whitlock Bakery. Just that, her name and what it was. No flourishes, no additional text, her name and the thing she'd built. Fitch and Silas got it hung between them, while Clara stood in the street and directed the level until it was right. And when it was right, she stood there for a moment that she didn't share with anyone, not even Silas, because some moments are yours alone, and this was one of them. Then she turned around, and Mabel Rourke was standing in the street behind her with 3 other women from the market, and Mabel had the expression of someone who had organized a thing and was pleased with how it had come together. We thought you might need an audience, Mabel said. Clara looked at them. She looked at the sign. She looked at Silas on the step, who had the grace to look like he had nothing to do with this, which she did not believe for a single second. I didn't arrange it, he said, catching her eye. He didn't, Mabel confirmed. I arranged it. He just didn't stop me. Clara looked at these women who had watched her haul a warped-leg table to market for 6 years, who had bought her bread and sent their neighbors to her stall, and listened to Gerald Pruitt say things about her plans, and not, for the most part, agreed with him. She thought about what it meant to have people witness something. Not to need the witness, she didn't need it. She'd done this without it, but to have it offered as a gift, freely, by people who'd chosen to be there. Thank you, she said, and meant it in the specific way you mean something when it's the right thing at the right time. Whitlock Bakery opened the first Saturday of July 1889. Clara had been awake since 4. She had 3 dozen loaves of bread rising by 5, 2 batches of apple pie cooling by 7, and a doorstep swept and a counter wiped down and a sign visible from the road by the time the first customer appeared at 7:30. It was Mabel. First customer, Mabel said, and put her coins on the counter for a whole loaf. You don't have to do that, Clara said. I'm hungry, Mabel said. Don't be sentimental. The morning moved from there. Not a flood, nothing so dramatic. A steady current of people, some curious, and some genuinely in need of bread, some who'd been waiting for her to have a fixed address, because the market stall had never been quite convenient for their schedule. By noon, she'd sold 2/3 of what she'd baked. By early afternoon, the bread was gone and only pie remained, and she sold that too, every slice, and stood behind her counter at closing time in a building that smelled like what she'd wanted it to smell like, and thought, all right. It started. Silas came at noon, not first thing, which she appreciated because it meant he was letting the morning be hers. He bought a slice of pie and stood at her counter and ate it there instead of taking it away, which was a first, and they talked for maybe 20 minutes about nothing in particular. And 3 different people who came in while he was there glanced between them with the particular glance of a town updating its understanding of something. Clara ignored the glances. So did Silas. When he left, he said, "Good first day." "Ask me after the winter," Clara said. He almost smiled. "I'll ask you after the winter." Summer was good, better than her cautious projections. The fixed address turned out to matter more than she'd calculated. People who would ride past a market stall without stopping would make a point of stopping at a bakery, because a bakery was a destination, and a stall was a convenience, and she was learning the difference. She took on a standing order for the schoolhouse, which gave her a weekly baseline that made the variable days easier to absorb. She worked out a barter arrangement with 2 farm families east of town, eggs and preserved fruit against bread that reduced her ingredient costs and gave her variety in what she could offer. She was also, for the first time in her working life, in one place all day, which was both better and harder than she'd expected. The market table had been exhausting in its own way, but it had also been moving, social, open to the air. The bakery was hers and she loved it, but it was also 4 walls and a single door, and some days the walls pressed. She mentioned this to Silas one Thursday evening, and he listened without trying to solve it, which was the right response. "My mother used to take her mending to the porch," he said, "even in cold weather sometimes, just to have the distance. I can't exactly bake on the porch. No, but you could close an hour earlier and take the long way home. She looked at him. The long way, she said. There's a creek road south of the main street. It takes maybe 20 minutes if you don't hurry. He looked at his coffee. I know it, because I used to ride it when I needed to think. You're suggesting I take a walk, Clara said. I'm suggesting the creek road, he said. Specifically, she took the creek road the next evening. She went alone, because that was the point, and it was exactly what he'd said 20 minutes if you didn't hurry. The creek running alongside, the cottonwoods heavy in their summer leaves, the particular quality of evening light that made everything look like it was still deciding what it wanted to be. She went back the evening after that. She started going most evenings. She did not immediately acknowledge, even to herself, that she was going somewhere. Silas had told her he went when he needed to think, that there was something intimate in that, the sharing of a private geography. She acknowledged it eventually, about 3 weeks in, standing at the bend where the creek turned south and the light hit the water at an angle that made her stop walking every time. She thought about intimacy, about the different forms it took and how she'd spent so many years being careful to avoid the kind that cost you yourself, that she'd gotten clumsy at recognizing the kind that didn't. The courtship, as Silas had called it, moved in the same way the rest of their relationship had moved carefully, and then, all at once, and then carefully again. He held her hand one evening in late July walking back from the creek, just reached for it without asking, and she let him, and they walked the rest of the way without making a thing of it. A week later, he kissed her on her doorstep, brief and deliberate, and she looked at him after and said nothing, and he nodded as if something had been confirmed and went home, and Clara stood at her closed door for a full minute before she could make herself move. She was not a woman who had been waiting for this. She needed to be clear about that, even in her own mind. She had not organized her life around absence or around hoping. She had built something, and the building was real and complete in itself, and what was happening with Silas was not a completion of something incomplete. It was its own thing, alongside the rest of it, neither lesser nor greater. She held on to that distinction carefully. She held on to it all the way until the conversation in September that nearly broke everything. It was an ordinary evening. She'd had a good week the standing school order had renewed. She'd picked up 2 new farm families from a recommendation. Mabel had spread through the eastern settlements, and the numbers for August had cleared the first-year projection she'd written in her ledger before she opened. She was tired in the specific way of someone who has been working at full capacity and is starting to feel the season in her bones. And Silas had come by, and they'd eaten together, and it was a comfortable, easy evening of the kind she'd stopped being surprised by and had started cautiously relying on. She was washing the dishes. He was sitting at her table. And then he said it. The house needs you. She stopped washing. The words sat in the kitchen with a weight he hadn't put in them. She was fairly sure, but that they carried anyway. She turned around. He was looking at the table, not at her, turning his coffee cup in his hands in the way he did when he'd said something before he'd finished thinking it through. He realized, even as she was turning, what had come out of his mouth, and she could see him understanding it. But she needed him to hear why it mattered. Say that again, she said. He looked up. Clara, say what you said. I need you to hear it. He was quiet for a moment. I said the house needs you. The house, Clara said. He heard it. She could see him hear it the way it landed, what it meant that he'd said the house and not I, what it meant that he'd reached for need and not want, what it sounded like from where she was standing. That's not he started. I know what you meant, she said. I believe you that you meant something else. But I need you to hear what you said. She put down the dish. My mother needed. She was needed every day of her adult life by a house and a family and a town, and she gave everything she had, and her name was on nothing. Not one thing. She died 2 years before I opened this bakery, and she never saw her name on a door. She was not raising her voice. I will not be a woman who is needed by a house. Silas was very still. A house can need another pair of hands, Clara said. A man should know whether he needs a housekeeper or wants a woman beside him. Those are different sentences. The kitchen was quiet. You're right, Silas said. She looked at him. You're right, he said again, and he said it without equivocation or defense or the particular retreating quality of a man who says you're right as a way of ending a conversation he doesn't want to have. He said it like it was true, because it was. I said it wrong. I said it wrong because I got scared, and when I get scared, I say things badly. He looked at her steadily. What I meant was that I want you there, not that the house needs you. Not that I need you the way a house needs tending. I want you there because it's where I want to be when you're there. He paused. That's what I meant to say. Clara stood with that. Then why didn't you say that? She said. Because it's more frightening, he said simply. She turned back to the sink. She stood there for a moment with her hands in the cooling water. Go home, Silas, she said, not cruelly, not with finality. Just go home and let this settle and let me be alone with it. He went. She heard the door close and the sound of his horse, and then the ordinary night sounds that came in when the human sounds left. She stood at the sink until the water was cold, and then she dried her hands and sat at the kitchen table in the same chair where she'd done her accounting for 6 years and thought. She thought about what he'd said wrong and what he'd said right after. She thought about the difference between those two things and what it cost a person to say the second one. She thought about men who didn't correct themselves, who doubled down, who said you're right with a smile that meant, let's stop talking about this. She thought about what it meant that Silas had said it with his eyes on her face and his hands still on the table and no attempt to make himself smaller or her smaller to fit the moment. She thought about her mother. She thought about what her mother would have said if she'd been sitting across the table from her now. Not what she would have advised her mother had never been in a position to give this particular advice, but what she would have said in the specific voice of a woman who had spent 40 years being needed and 10 minutes, probably, being wanted. Clara thought her mother would have said, don't be a fool in the wrong direction. Don't be so determined not to repeat the past that you refuse the present. She sat with that for a long time. 2 Saturdays passed. Silas did not come to the bakery. She told herself she was fine with this. She ran the bakery. She took the creek road every evening. She had the conversation she'd had with herself in the September of the previous year, the one about the difference between being careful and being closed, and she had it more honestly this time because she was better at honesty than she'd been a year ago, or maybe just less able to afford the dishonesty. On the 3rd Saturday morning, she was behind her counter when Mabel came in. Mabel did not buy bread. Mabel stood at the counter with her hands folded and said, "He went to the building." Clara looked up. "What building?" "Your building," Mabel said. "This building. He came by 2 hours ago before you opened, and he stood in front of it, and then he went around to look at the east corner of the roof." Clara put down what she was holding. "And then," Mabel continued, in the tone of someone who has a conclusion to get to, "he walked down to the end of Territorial Road, where that building is the empty cooperage, the one past the post, and he stood there for a while, and then he came back and he stood in front of your building again." Clara stared at her. "What was he doing at the cooperage?" "I have no idea," Mabel said serenely. "I was watching from across the street, and I didn't go ask him because it looked private." She paused. "He had a measuring rope." Clara was very still. "He left about an hour ago," Mabel said. He didn't look. He looked like a man who'd been thinking hard about something and hadn't finished. She met Clara's eyes. "I thought you should know." Clara stood behind her counter in her bakery with her name on the sign outside and thought about a man who had measured the doorway of an empty feed store with a rope in his pocket before she'd gotten a loan or a key, and who was apparently now standing in front of cooperatives with a rope, and who had said the wrong thing in her kitchen and then said the right thing after, and who had not come to the bakery for 2 Saturdays, and who was evidently thinking hard about something. She thought about what he might be thinking about. She thought she might know. She closed the bakery at noon, which she had never done on a Saturday, and she put a note on the door that said closed. Back Monday, and she walked to where she'd tied her mule, and she rode south. She found him at the fence line, where she'd found him the first time not injured, this time just walking it the way he walked it when he needed to do something with his body, while his head worked through something. He heard her coming and turned, and the look on his face was not surprise, which told her either Mabel had sent word ahead or he'd been expecting her, and she suspected both. She got down from the mule. "You were measuring the cooperage," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I've been trying to figure out what I should have said in your kitchen." He paused. "And I think I know now. Tell me." He didn't look away. "I want you beside me. Not beside the house, not filling the space that's empty, not because it's practical or because it makes sense for two people running operations near each other. I want you specifically, Clara, because the way you think about things and the way you argue with bank managers and the way you talk about a building that doesn't exist yet like it's already real, all of it because of you. Specifically." He stopped. "That's what I should have said." Clara looked at him. "The cooperage," she said. Something crossed his face. "There's a good building 2 doors down from yours. Solid bones, better roof than your east corner." He paused. "I was thinking about whether the smithing operation I was looking at would work better there or in a property south of the ridge. Logistically, a smithing operation," Clara said. "I've been thinking about diversifying the ranch operation. Metalwork." He said this in the careful voice of a man who has rehearsed an explanation and is aware it's transparent. "It would make sense to have a town presence, Silas." "Yes, you were thinking about being closer to town." A pause. "I was thinking about a lot of things. Were any of them about me?" "Most of them," he said, without pause. She looked at him for a long moment in the September afternoon, with the fence line running west, and the ranch behind him, and the ridge road back to town behind her, and all the months of Saturdays and threshold conversations and careful distances between them. "Come to dinner on Thursday," she said. "Clara, come to dinner on Thursday," she said again, steadily. "And say what you were going to say on my doorstep before I tell you to go home next time, instead of after." He looked at her. "Next time," he said. "Next time," she confirmed. He came to dinner on Thursday. He said what he'd been going to say, which was not elegant, and was not the speech off the paper he'd had in his pocket in April, and was in some ways the most honest and unsteady thing she'd ever heard from him, that he loved her, that he wanted to marry her if she'd have him, that he was not asking because the ranch needed tending, or because he needed a housekeeper, or because it was practical, that he was asking because he wanted every year from this one forward to include her in it, and because her independence was not something he needed her to give up, but something he loved about her, and that he knew the difference, even if he sometimes said it wrong. Clara let him finish. Then she said, "There are conditions." "I expected that," he said. "My name stays on the bakery. Of course, my account stays separate. Yes, I keep the Creek Road evenings." He almost smiled. "I wouldn't dream of taking the Creek Road. And if you ever say the house needs you again—" "I know," he said. "I'll hear it before it comes out." She looked at him across her kitchen table. This man who had ridden 7 miles every Saturday for a year on the excuse of pie, who had come to her with a rope in his pocket and an honest answer to every question she'd asked him, who had said the wrong thing and corrected it without being told twice, who had measured a cooperage 2 doors down from her bakery because he was thinking about being closer to town. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. "You keep doing that," she said. "What?" "Exhaling like you've been holding your breath." "I have been," he said, "more or less since April." Before the wedding, which was small and cold in late October, with Mabel Rourke as witness and the Kemper family attending, and Pete and Caleb looking uncomfortable in clean shirts, Silas went to the bedroom and came back with Evelyn's shawl folded in his hands. Clara watched him. "I'm going to put this away," he said, "in the cedar chest. Not throwing it out. I'm just not going to leave it on the peg anymore." Clara looked at him. "You don't have to do that for me," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it for me." He held the shawl for a moment. "I loved her. That's real. And it doesn't go away, and I'm not asking it to." He met Clara's eyes. "But I'm here now. And the shawl on the peg was keeping me from being fully here." He paused. Evelyn would have thought it was foolish. She was practical. More practical than me, mostly. Clara thought about a woman who had loved mornings on the porch with cold coffee, who had been practical, who had been loved well and lost too soon. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Clara said. She was, Silas said. You have some things in common. He put the shawl in the cedar chest. He closed the lid. He came back and stood in the doorway and looked at Clara with the clear, present eyes that she had first seen on a fever-broke morning and had been looking for in every subsequent face-to-face conversation since. "Ready?" he said. "I've been ready," Clara said. The first winter of their marriage was also the first winter of the bakery's real test, and the two things happening simultaneously was not lost on Clara, who had always believed that the true measure of anything was what it looked like under pressure rather than in good conditions. The pressure came in November. Snow closed the roads from the farms east of town, which cut off a third of her customer base. Flour prices climbed when the supply route from Casper was disrupted for 2 weeks. 3 of her standing orders went quiet because the families they came from were managing their own winter hardships, and bread was a luxury when survival was the first problem. Clara sat behind her counter on a December Tuesday with the accounting open in front of her and a number that did not work, and she sat with it for a long time. She was not surprised. She had known a first winter would be hard. She had saved a margin against this. The margin was smaller than she'd like and larger than she'd feared, and it was going to require adaptation, not surrender. She adapted. She expanded from specialty pies and good bread into the most basic, affordable loaves she could make, at a price that families under financial pressure'd manage. She went to Mabel, who still ran her dry goods stall through the winter network of informal sellers, and she made an arrangement. Mabel would carry word through the eastern settlements that Whitlock Bakery had affordable bread available for regular order. In return, Clara would give Mabel's operation a first referral whenever someone came to the bakery looking for dry goods. Mabel looked at the proposal. "You know I'd have done this without a trade," Mabel said. "I know," Clara said, "but this is better. It makes it mutual." Mabel looked at her in the way she'd looked at her since the first day Clara had pushed back on Gerald Pruitt at the market, which was the look of a woman recognizing something she approved of. "All right," she said. "Mutual it is." The farm families started coming in. Not the ones closest to town, who had always come the ones further out, who had heard through the settlement network that the bakery had changed its pricing structure for winter. They came on horseback, sometimes. A 6-mile ride for bread, because 6 miles in January was not a small thing, but regular affordable bread was not a small thing either. And Clara understood the calculation they were making, because she'd made the same one herself in different forms for years. She learned their names. She learned which families had children and how many, and she started making an extra half-loaf of the basic bread on Tuesdays that she sold at cost for families with more than 3 children. A decision she didn't announce and didn't make a charity of, but that people figured out quickly, as people in small places always figure things out. January was still hard. February was harder. Clara came home one February evening with the numbers she'd been looking at and sat across from Silas at the table they'd been eating at together since October, the same table where she'd done her accounting for 6 years. And she said, "I need to tell you where the bakery actually is right now." He put down what he was reading. "Tell me," she told him. The real numbers, not the managed version she'd been keeping in her head, the actual state of the first payment structure, and what February's reduced income meant for March. She told him without performing confidence she didn't feel, because she had decided somewhere in the fall that honesty with Silas was a thing she was going to commit to, and that meant honesty about the hard parts, and not just the victories. He listened. "What do you need?" he said. "I need you to hear it," she said. "It's most of it, all right," he said. "I'm hearing it." He paused. "Is there a specific thing I can do? Can Caleb make deliveries? 2 mornings a week, the eastern settlements. I'll pack the bread. He just has to write it out." She looked at him. "Pay him for the time, Clara. You don't need to." "I pay him for the time," she said. Silas looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Caleb can do that." The deliveries started the second week of February, and by the end of the month, the Eastern settlement numbers had stabilized enough that the March payment was going to be tight but possible. Clara made it. She made the April payment with slightly less difficulty, and the May payment with enough room that she sat with the ledger afterward and permitted herself to write the word margin in the column. Spring came the way spring always came in that country, Suddenly, and with some residual argument, and the roads opened and the customers came back, and in April, a woman from a settlement 12 miles east rode 2 hours specifically to buy a birthday pie, which was the moment Clara understood that the winter hadn't just survived her bakery, it had made it known. Word had traveled through Mabel's network, through Caleb's delivery routes, through the farm families who had come 6 miles for bread in January and told their neighbors about it when spring made visiting possible again. Whitlock Bakery was, by May of its second year, not a novelty or a curiosity, but a fixture, the kind of place people rode to specifically, budgeted for, sent their neighbors to. Clara stood in her bakery on the first Saturday of May and looked at her counter, the one Silas had built. 10 feet, north wall, right height, and at the customers moving through her space, and she thought about a market table with a warped leg and a name on nothing. She thought about her mother. She thought about the promise. She'd kept it, not perfectly, not in the exact form she'd imagined at 14, but the substance of it, the thing that had mattered, the piece she'd been protecting, all this time her name on the door, her decision in the bank, her business, her life built by her own choices in her own hands that was intact. That was real. The years ahead would bring their own hard winters, and she didn't pretend otherwise, but she was going to face them from a position she had built, and that made all the difference. 4 years later, on a Saturday morning in the 5th year of Whitlock Bakery, Clara was behind her counter at 7 o'clock when she heard the sound. She'd been waiting for horses' hooves on the road, a particular familiar rhythm, and then the door. Silas came in carrying their daughter, who was 2.5 and red-haired and had, according to everyone in Red Willow Crossing who felt entitled to an opinion, her mother's eyes and her father's patience, though Clara had some thoughts about that characterization. The little girl was called May, for no reason that had seemed logical before she arrived, and for every reason that felt right after. Silas set May on the counter, which was absolutely not a sanctioned practice in a commercial bakery, and which Clara permitted because May placed both hands flat on the wood and looked around with the expression of someone surveying a domain she intended to inherit. "Good morning," Silas said. "You're early," Clara said. "She was awake at 5, he said, in the tone of a man who has discovered that parenthood does not negotiate with your schedule. "She gets that from you. She does not get that from me." "You were at my fence line before sunrise the second time you came to the ranch," Clara said. "I have never been awake voluntarily at 5. May reached for the nearest pie, which she had been doing since she could reach, and Clara intercepted her hand with the automatic ease of someone who had been doing this for 2 years and set a small piece of the current week's apple in front of her instead. May considered this an adequate compromise. Silas leaned against the counter and looked at the bakery the way he sometimes did when he thought she wasn't watching the look of a man accounting for something he was glad about. 5 years of Saturdays in this room. The counter he'd built with his own hands, smooth from use now, the railing along the front edge that he'd added and that she'd immediately recognized as correct. The shelves on the east wall full of bread, the sign above the door visible from the road. Clara set a slice of apple pie on the cloth in front of him. He looked at it, and then looked at her. "Wouldn't dream of changing my order," he said, "this late in our acquaintance." It was the same thing he'd said at the market table years ago, the first time he'd made a joke and she'd understood that the Saturdays were never going to be just about pie. She'd been right about that. She'd been right about the bones of things generally, the building, the business, this man, this life. "May," she said to her daughter, who was finishing her apple and plotting her next move, "tell your father to sit down and eat." May looked at her father. "Down," she said with authority. Silas sat down. Clara turned back to the counter and the morning customers and the bread and the work of the things she'd built, and behind her the bakery was warm and full and alive with the specific noise of a Saturday. And outside her window, Red Willow Crossing was going about its business in the way of places that have absorbed you into their fabric without your quite noticing when it happened. She was not loved because she was useful. She was not recognized because she had made herself agreeable. She was not here because someone had needed her to be here. She was here because she had decided to be, every step of the way, on terms she had set, in a building with her name on the door, in a life she had built from flour and stubbornness and an absolute refusal to let anyone else decide what it was worth. That was the thing no one had told her. At 14, standing at her mother's table, that you could want it all. The bakery and the man who measured doorways with rope in his pocket, the name on the door and the person beside you in the morning, the independence and the love, that those were not opposites, that you didn't have to choose, that the choosing was in how you built it and not in what you gave up. You could be loved without being owned. You could be needed without being confined. You could stand in the middle of everything you'd built and reach back and feel the hand of someone who knew exactly what you'd done to get there and was glad of it, not in spite of it. Clara placed 2 more slices on the counter. Mace stole a piece of Silas's. He let her. Outside, the morning was doing what May mornings did in this part of the country, coming in gold and clear and enormous. The kind of day that made you understand why people stayed in hard places. Because the good days were worth it. Because anything worth having cost something. Because the woman who had once sat in a dark kitchen eating pie alone and making promises to herself had turned those promises into something real and solid and hers. The door opened. Another customer. Clara looked up. "Morning," she said. "What can I get you?" And the Saturday went on.